All right, everybody. Welcome back to George Orwell's Animal Farm. I can't believe we're going to finish the book today. We're going to be in Chapter 10, or Chapter X in Roman numerals. So when you're ready, we will follow along on page 127. And again, you're supposed to follow along in your own book and only look up at the screen when you get lost or we ask you to point something out or to mark something. Now, before we start Chapter 10, the final chapter, think back to Chapter 9. What happened to Boxer? That was one of our big questions. Boxer was injured, and he was supposed to be taken in this cart to the veterinarian. And if you look closely, that's not exactly what happened. Those pigs, as crafty and as evil as they are, they even turned the death of Boxer to their own advantage. And we talked about how they use that to get some other things that they want, and so on and so forth. So with that, let's start Chapter 10, the final chapter of Animal Farm. It says, "Years passed. The seasons came and went. The short animal lives fled by. A time came when there was no one who remembered the old days before the rebellion except Clover, Benjamin, Moses the raven, and a number of the pigs. Muriel was dead. Bluebell, Jessie, and Pincher were dead. Jones, too, was dead. He had died in an inebriate's home in another part of the country." You might want to underline that word, inebriates. Fancy, nice way of saying a home for drunks or people who are addicted to alcohol, alcoholics. Inebriate is a person who's an alcoholic. All right, next part. Snowball was forgotten. Boxer was forgotten, except by the few who had known him. Clover was an old stout mare now. There's that word again, stout, meaning what? Kind of big. Clover was an old stout mare now, stiff in the joints and with a tendency to rheumy eyes. She was 2 years past the retiring age, but in fact, no animal had ever actually retired. Interesting. Put an exclamation point next to that. I remember when they started off Animal Farm, they talked quite a bit about animals being able to retire, and somehow those sneaky, sneaky pigs have kept that from happening. The talk of setting aside a corner of the pasture for superannuated animals had long since been dropped. That was one of our words from last chapter, superannuated. Remember? Super means above and beyond. Annuated is like annual in years. Annual. So superannuated, or above in years. Really, really old is what superannuated means. Napoleon was now a mature boar of 24 stone. Squealer was so fat that he could with difficulty see out of his eyes. Only old Benjamin was much the same as ever, except for being a little grayer about the muzzle, and, since Boxer's death, more morose and taciturn than ever. All right. Next page. There were many more creatures on the farm now, though the increase was not so great as had been expected in earlier years. Many animals had been born to whom the rebellion was only a dim tradition, passed on by word of mouth, and others had been bought who had never heard mention of such a thing before their arrival. The farm possessed 3 horses now besides Clover. They were fine, upstanding beasts, willing workers, and good comrades, but very stupid. So we go back to what? Remember those horses that do all the work represent what? That's right, our proletariats, our working class. Those individuals who did all of the work that lifted up society, especially in the Soviet Union. So Boxer's gone, right? But old workers will be replaced with new workers. And that's exactly what's happened on Animal Farm, and that's what's happened in the Soviet Union. All right, let's go back to it. Very stupid. All right, right here now. None of them proved. None of them proved able to learn the alphabet beyond the letter B. They accepted everything that they were told about the rebellion and the principles of animalism, especially from Clover, for whom they had an almost filial respect. So there's that word, filial. We could cover that up and try and figure out what that means. They had a blank respect, a tremendous respect, a huge amount of respect. Filial is some word that makes it sound like it's very, very respectful. Maybe a loving respect? All right, what else would make sense there? For whom they had an almost blank respect. And then when we look up filial in the dictionary, sure enough, we'll find out what that word means as long as it matches up with the sentence. But it was doubtful whether they understood very much of it. The farm was more prosperous now and better organized. It had even been enlarged by 2 fields which had been bought from Mr. Pilkington. The windmill had been successfully completed at last, and the farm possessed a threshing machine and a hay elevator of its own, and various new buildings had been added to it. Whymper had bought himself a dog cart. The windmill, however, had not after all been used for generating electrical power. It was used for milling corn. and brought in a handsome money profit. And there's the word handsome. Handsome can mean really, really good looking, right? But in this case, it means what? Brought in a blank money profit. Quite a large or quite attractive money profit. The animals were hard at work building yet another windmill. When that one was finished, so it was said, the dynamos would be installed. But the luxuries which Snowball had once taught the animals to dream, the stalls with electric light, and hot and cold water, and the 3-day week were no longer talked about. Napoleon had denounced such ideas as contrary, next page, to the spirit of animalism. The truest happiness, he said, lay in working hard and living frugally. Oh, there's a cool word, frugally. Living frugally means what? Kind of living cheaply but smartly. Okay, and living in a very humble way. Not with a lot of extravagance or pleasure or cool stuff, but just living in a very simple way. Frugally. Somehow it seemed as though the farm had grown richer without making the animals themselves any richer, except, of course, for the pigs and the dogs. Perhaps this was partly because there were so many pigs and so many dogs. It was not that these creatures did not work after their fashion. So you get the implied message there. They're not really working, they're what? Supervising or running things. There was, as Squealer was never tired of explaining, endless work in the supervision and organization of the farm. Much of this work was of a kind that the other animals were too ignorant to understand. For example, Squealer told them that the pigs had to expend enormous labors every day upon mysterious things called files, reports, minutes, and memoranda. These were large sheets of paper which had to be closely covered with writing, and as soon as they were so covered, they were burnt in the furnace. That's just weird. This was the highest importance for the welfare of the farm, Squealer said. But still, neither pigs nor dogs produced any food by their own labor, and there were very many of them, and their appetites were always good. Sorry, I think I lost my screen there for a second. But here we go. Bottom of 129. As for the others, their life, so far as they knew, was as it had always been. They were generally hungry. They slept on straw. They drank from the pool. They labored in the fields. In winter they were troubled by the cold, and in summer by the flies. Sometimes the older ones among them racked their dim memories and tried to determine whether in the early days of the rebellion, when Jones's expulsion was still recent, things had been better or worse than now. They could not remember. And so that's one of the big questions, is when it's all said and done, are they better off or worse off? Neither, somewhere in between, when it comes to what life was like before they got rid of Jones and now that they've got rid of him and the pigs are in charge. Your assignment is to read 129, bottom of 129, to the end of the book Animal Farm, and enjoy.